Thank you, Darlene, for your wise words and for starting us in such a good way. Because we have a very full 2-hour session, I'll be brief. I will share my screen again. Oh. So just first some housekeeping announcements. Please note that this session is being recorded and the recording will be posted to the BCAFN website. We will share the link with you in a follow-up email, I hope this week. If you have any technical issues, please contact Joanna Prince or myself in the chat box or call Joanna at a number that is shown on the screen. Here is today's agenda. We will start by welcoming BCFN Regional Chief Terry Tiji, who will provide some opening remarks. Then we will have 4 presentations and a dialogue period. This part of our agenda will be moderated by Joseph Peland from Ecoatress, Canada. Finally, we will briefly share some information with you on the exciting initiative that BCFN and Ecoatress Canada are currently working on. So now I will welcome Regional Chief Terry Tiji for opening remarks. Please proceed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Masi Cho, to the Knowledge Keeper for the opening prayer. Denizat Sekuzat Skies. First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm calling from, the unceded, unsurrendered, continually occupied territory of the Lheidli T'enneh, the territory of the Dakat people just outside of Prince George. I just want to thank you all for attending today in terms of this subject matter, which is carbon offsets, and to look at really a Indigenous and First Nations perspective in regards to carbon offsets, and also the issue of really what lies underneath taking over jurisdiction over carbon offsets is our jurisdiction as Indigenous peoples. More and more attention has been paid to nature-based solutions, and carbon offsets are a key component to mitigate the issue of carbon pollution and the imbalance that we're experiencing right now in terms of climate change and what have you. And also carbon offsets can be utilized to address issues with biodiversity loss, and really, I think more importantly, adapt to climate change impacts that we have seen over the last year here in British Columbia, really ground zero with the issues that we've experienced last summer and in the fall with the many atmospheric rivers that were devastating to many First Nations communities in this province. Over the last 2 years at the British Columbia Assembly of First Nations, we have been exploring options on how to support First Nations in carbon offset projects in a way that that really respects and reaffirms Indigenous rights, title, and interests. We certainly believe that land-based carbon offsets led by Indigenous peoples could represent a real opportunity to address climate change while dealing with the urgent issues, including biodiversity loss and economic injustice that many First Nations have historically experienced in this province and continue to experience. Indigenous peoples are attached to our territories in our culture, in particular, from the territory we're from. We say we're Yinka Dene, we're people of the earth. Our cultures, beliefs, and survival depend on the lands, and certainly our inherent rights and responsibilities were born out of the land, and certainly from our ancestors and many centuries, we are connected to these lands. There will not be a successful land-based carbon offset project or markets without recognizing and affirming this connection with our respective territories and our lands, including our jurisdiction, especially in light of the current federal and provincial policies that need to recognize the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This includes the jurisdictions over our lands, carbon storage capacity, and the potential benefits that this can bring. To really understand how carbon offsets works, what are opportunities, limitations First Nations are facing to develop carbon offset projects, we here at the BCAFN prepared land-based carbon offset discussion paper. This will be presented today by its author and former carbon specialist at the BCAFN, Michelle Connolly. The discussion paper is part of BCFN's efforts to advocate for respect for First Nations rights and meaningful engagement of rights holders when developing, reforming federal and provincial carbon offset policies and frameworks. This discussion paper seeks to provide information to First Nations about land-based carbon offset development and to promote discussions about the recognition of carbon rights and the economic benefits that flow from these rights. We're also working on other initiatives right now related to carbon, including a project with Ecoatress Canada, who is with us today and brings expertise in carbon offset development. We certainly hope this session will be useful for your First Nations communities. With your communities, I'd like to thank Coastal First Nations and Great Bear Rainforest Carbon Project for sharing their valuable experience with you today, and also Assembly of First Nations, the BC government, and also Michelle Connolly from Ecoatress Canada for making this dialogue session happen. Climate change is threatening us, and everybody has a role, and we all have a role to play in this fight. Only by working collaboratively will we face this challenge successfully. I want to thank you all today, and certainly hope this dialogue sessions opens the door in terms of really discussing with your respective community how you can really assert your rights, title, interests, especially in regards to carbon, because certainly it is an opportunity for many of our First Nations communities. I want to thank the BCAFN staff for putting this together, and thank you all, and I hope you have a good session today. I will be in for the most of this session, but if you have any questions, you know where to contact my staff, Patricia, and the rest of my staff at the BCAFN. Thank you, Masicho.
Thank you, RC, for sharing with us today. And now we will start our dialogue, and I'd like to welcome Joseph Peland, the Director of Climate Innovation at Ecoatress Canada, who will help us moderate the panel. Joseph has been a pioneer in shaping Canada's carbon market since 2004, building leading-edge offset projects, contributing to the development of strong standards, and helping society understand the role of ecosystem-based projects in halting climate change. He developed fierce of projects in forestry, fuel switching, and transportation, founded CPS Carbon Project Solutions, Inc., as well as Blockchain for Climate Foundation, putting the Paris Agreement on the blockchain, Canada's Clean 50s, and Cointelegraph, Crypto Top 100 award winner. Wow. Joseph's work in insights and advocacy continue to shape the growth of Canada's low carbon economy. Passing over to you, Joseph.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the welcome. Thank you for sharing where you are all hailing from today. It's a great honor to get to speak with you and to get to be part of this discussion around carbon offset development in British Columbia, and how First Nations, BC First Nations, can use this tool to achieve their landscape management priorities, build and secure more rights and more direction, and in a tool that also has a deep economic development functionality to it. So as Patricia noted, I'm a long-term carbon market geek. I've been developing carbon offset projects and the tools to make this all happen for a long time. And it's a real delight to get to work with BCAFN, to get to work with many of you presenting or on the call, to move this all forward. So let's get down to that. So I'm going to introduce the speakers that we're going to have over the next hour or so. You'll have to keep some of them in your mind because I'm going to present them their bios quickly right now, and then they will be able to flow one into the other. So first, we're going to hear from Michelle Connolly. She's a project manager on Ecoatress Canada's climate innovation team and a colleague of mine. Michelle managed the Northern Climate Solutions Research Program for 6 years and worked at BCAFN as a carbon specialist in 2020-2021. During her work with BCAFN, Michelle prepared a discussion paper titled First Nations Carbon, which she'll be presenting during her presentation. Michelle has also worked with all levels of government to develop and communicate conservation policy, support land management, and administrate tenure. Michelle holds an MSc in Forest Disturbance Ecology at UNBC, and will be great to hear from her today. After Michelle, we'll be moving on to David Oxley and Danny Warren from the Coastal First Nations and Great Bear Rainforest Carbon Project. David and Danny work for the Great Bear Carbon Credit Limited Partnership, and they'll share their experience with the Great Bear Rainforest Carbon Project. David is the Business Corporations Manager with Coastal First Nations and the Great Bear Initiative. After working 20 years in the social services sector, David started in 2015 with Coastal First Nations as an IT administrator, and then in 2016, he became more involved with the carbon offsets as a business corporations coordinator and the Great Bear Carbon Credit Limited Partnership. David has since then built the infrastructure that all offsets in their program are managed today, maintaining strong relationships with all the member nations and sales partners of this very big, complex, and amazing project. He's passionate about carbon education, committed to maximizing the funding for Coastal First Nations, and for helping them reach their goals for languages, culture, a stable economic future, and protecting the Great Bear Rainforest and all that live within it. Danny Warren. Danny Warren is the corporate administrator with Coastal First Nations and the Great Bear Initiative since 2022. Danny is Cree and a member of the Montreal Lake Cree Nation. She has a recent background in project and property management with BOSA Properties and 49 North Partners. She is passionate to work with those in need and spent 5 years with the St. Paul Hospital's security team frontline with patrons from the downtown east side and the City of Burnaby warming centers overnight, and with the City of Burnaby's warming centers for overnight shelter program. Outside of working life, Danny is a competitive bagpiper with the SFU RMM Pipe Band organization and holds a director position as a board member with the BC Pipers Association. Welcome, Danny. After that, we'll move on to folks with the Assembly of First Nations, and we have William David with the Mohawks of Aksquanasne. William is currently the Director of Economic Development with the Assembly of First Nations. He holds a degree in environmental engineering science from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, and a law degree from the University of Ottawa, where he contributed to research on the effects of Indigenous title on carbon trading regimes. Mr. David has over 20 years experience working to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples at the community, national, and international levels, including territorial rights of Indigenous peoples in the context of environmental conservation and climate change through the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. William will present potential co-benefits from carbon offset projects for First Nations in the Canadian context. We'll then have Warren Greaves from the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Welcome, Warren. Warren is a senior economic advisor for the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Over the last decade, Warren has supported major sustainability initiatives in the nonprofit, private, and public sectors. Warren has worked with 2 Canadian provincial governments to develop climate policy. And currently, Warren leads the development of nature-based carbon offset standards and methodologies at the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Warren will present an overview of BC's offset program and requirements, the BC Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, and a summary of the timing and next steps BC will take to support forest carbon offset projects, which I and many other on the call are fascinated to learn about. So very exciting to have all you August speakers on the call today. And I would like to hand the mic over to Michelle Connolly. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. My name is Michelle Connolly. I've turned off my video because it'll enable me to avoid having this presentation cut out, and so that you guys can hear me better. I am a project manager with the Climate Innovation Team in Ecoatress Canada. Sophia, do you mind going to the next slide? So my parents immigrated from Ireland and Ecuador, and my home is in beautiful Claytley Tenay territory, and I'm in Haida Gwaii today near Masset. I came to be interested in carbon offsets 3 years ago as a potential revenue generator for First Nations communities interested in alternatives to industrially logging primary forest. And I'm glad to have had the chance to explore that with the BC Assembly of First Nations. Everything I covered today is covered in more detail in the paper that all attendees have. I want to add that there are people on this call with a lot more practical experience and knowledge on carbon offset projects than I have, so I look forward to learning from them today as well. Thank you. Okay, so today we're going to talk about what a carbon offset is, what First Nations rights are with regards to them, and current opportunities and barriers. Next slide, please. So carbon is an element that connects us to Mother Earth. It's found in our bodies, the atmosphere, the soil, and the Earth's crust. Forests, wetlands, grasslands, and the oceans all absorb and store carbon in living and dead plants through a process that has been occurring for millions of years called photosynthesis. And all those reservoirs also release carbon over time. So carbon can be transferred from one reservoir to another in seconds or over thousands of years. And carbon balance is about the land's ability to absorb and store carbon and release it at rates that don't overwhelm the atmosphere. Indigenous people maintained Earth's carbon balance for millennia. Next slide, please. Industrialization brought the burning of fossil fuels, which transferred carbon from under the Earth's crust to the atmosphere. And the conversion of forests and grasslands into cities and farms and plantations also altered 1 billion tons of carbon emissions every year, but only about half of that actually goes into the atmosphere. The rest goes into nature. And that is why protecting nature is so critical to protecting the climate. So reducing fossil fuel use is an essential step towards restoring Earth's carbon balance. But protecting, restoring, and improving the management of land increases the overall stock of carbon pulled out and kept out of the atmosphere for a period. So protecting and maintaining natural ecosystems is at the top of the list for how we effectively address climate change. And offsets are a potential tool for that if they are designed and implemented properly. And this is really key. Next slide, please. So the market for carbon offset credits or carbon credits is, so the output of carbon offset project of any kind, including a land-based carbon offset project, is it represents an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide or an equivalent amount of another greenhouse gas that has been reduced already. So it's happened in the recent past. Offsets are a financial tool. Next slide, please. The market for carbon offset credits or carbon credits is rooted in international efforts to control the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It comes from the idea that we all share one atmosphere and that it doesn't matter where emissions originate, they affect us all. So carbon markets were set up to answer the question, how do we control the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? And they first emerged following agreements under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which enabled an entity such as a government or a company to purchase a quantified emission reduction from an other entity in order to comply with their own national commitment or target. So in a carbon market, indirect emission reductions via carbon offsets can be exchanged from one entity to another entity. And another way to look at it is that they are a tool to connect supply and demand for emissions reductions. Next slide, please. So why do we need to talk about First Nations carbon rights? Well, participation in the carbon market requires that the entity providing the offset has the legal right to it. So in other words, for emissions reductions to be claimed through a carbon credit and traded as a commodity, that ton of carbon that is reduced needs to be owned. And that's kind of a hard idea to get your head around. It took a while for me to understand how that works. First Nations' rights to the carbon stored on their lands is for the most part not recognized by BC or Canada. And I think that this is the biggest barrier to more First Nations land-based carbon offsets here. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So in BC, the government takes the position that in the absence of any agreement or legislation to the contrary, it is the owner of the rights to benefit from offset projects on, quote, Crown land, except in relation to lands where Aboriginal title has been proven. So an atmospheric benefit sharing agreement, or an ABSA, is how BC currently allocates the right to benefit from the sale of carbon credits on, quote, Crown land to a First Nation or other party. And this does not include private land or reserve land. So, for example, the Cheakamus Community Forest and the Great Bear Initiative, which we're going to be hearing about today, are the only completed First Nations-led carbon offsets projects in BC, and they have atmospheric benefit sharing agreements. Next slide, please. So this slide has a lot of words on it because I get a bit nervous when I'm talking about legal stuff. I got this information from a fairly recent report. Mary Kate Craig wrote this. It was paraphrased from the Legal Review of First Nations Rights to Carbon Credits report. And it's a nature-based solutions, Indigenous-led conservation and carbon storage in Canada. So a First Nation can claim ownership, and thus ownership and the rights of use are still retained by them. They can assert territorial jurisdiction over forests and areas that can be managed and conserved in a way that is compatible with recognizing the existence of carbon rights that underlie carbon offsets. And this could happen in areas controlled by First Nations governance structures, under settled land claims agreements, on reserves and off reserves through assertion of Aboriginal title. Or a First Nation can argue that they have Aboriginal and treaty rights to or related to conservation and environmental management practices that would result in the ability to own and sell carbon credits. Next slide, please. Thank you, Sophia, for doing this. When people talk about the quality of a carbon offset credit, they're referring to the level of confidence that one can have that the offset fulfills some basic things. Next slide, please. So a high quality offset meets these criteria. It has to be real. It actually has to reduce or remove a ton of carbon dioxide or equivalent of another gas. So you ask the question, how does the project do that? It has to be quantifiable. So how do you count and measure the benefit? It must go beyond business as usual, and people refer to this as additionality. Would these greenhouse gas emissions reductions have occurred in the absence of a market for offset credits? That's a key question here. If they would, then they are probably not additional. Are the proposed activities legally required? If they are, then additionality is not met. Is the project financially attractive in the absence of carbon offset revenues? Is it common practice? They must be permanent. So 100-year permanence is the common benchmark. How will the project ensure that the reductions endure for a period of 100 years at least? And it's when you're talking about this that you hear people talk about natural disturbances like fire, potentially threatening forests that are part of a carbon project. And this is why most forest carbon projects have something called an insurance pool or a buffer pool. So you pull from that when something like a fire occurs. I want to add that a lot more carbon is retained in what's left behind after a fire than some might be aware of. And there's emerging research backing that up. In any case, disturbances like fire and insects are normal and unavoidable and should be included in the calculations of the baseline and project emissions. And I'm going to be explaining that in a minute. And lastly here, verification helps to assure that information reported about a carbon project rate emission reductions from a project, that's really important, It's usually done by someone with experience assessing the information or data provided by the people who develop the project. It's kind of like an audit, in that you take a selection of the information and you compare that against the existing standards. I also want to mention something called leakage, which is when market pressures to push logging activity elsewhere. And in doing that, kind of voids the climate benefits of the carbon project. So the key question with leakage is, are the greenhouse gas emitting activities simply moving elsewhere? And next slide, please, Sophia. So offset credits are issued based on the difference between emissions from what business as usual would have looked like and emissions from the project. Baseline emissions are the ones that would happen in the absence of a project or the carbon market, and project emissions are the ones associated with the project. So it's the difference between the two that creates the offset credits. Next slide, please. I'm going to go through this really quickly because the report goes into more detail about these things. Typically, a carbon offset project requires the preparation of a project plan that needs to be validated. You have to implement the project in line with the project plan that you've created. As I mentioned, verification, make sure you're implementing it as described in the project plan. And then the last two are just steps to creating offset credits. So issuance and registration, and then the sale of the credits. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go through some of the potential barriers and opportunities for First Nations developing land-based carbon projects. Again, these are described in more detail in the discussion paper. So Crown recognition of First Nations jurisdiction over their territories is limited, and carbon rights have not yet been defined across most of BC. So defining land tenure and carbon rights is, I think, the biggest barrier to First Nations participation in carbon markets. The Declaration Act may offer new opportunities for negotiating carbon rights on a government-to-government basis. Negotiating atmospheric benefit sharing agreements with the BC government can be time-consuming and slow. Carbon and conservation projects can create tensions among communities with shared territories. However, the BC Assembly of First Nations has produced some helpful resources on this topic. If you haven't looked at them, I would suggest that. Carbon opportunities can be sometimes perceived as risky or complicated and can lead to fears of dispossession from a community. And of course, a lack of trust can make partnership building with Crown governments or between First Nations communities a bit of a challenge. There are other challenges as well, but I'll go into the, the opportunities next. Next slide, please. So the introduction of the Declaration Act, as I mentioned, may offer new opportunities for recognizing First Nations success. Projects can enable self-determination when they are established and managed according to First Nations legal knowledge and governance systems, and they can be an expression of Indigenous nationhood. And if they're designed and implemented well, they can support community goals. Carbon markets can contribute to economic diversification. Developing carbon credits can create direct and indirect jobs. They can generate employment and funding to seed social enterprises and new businesses with a sustainability focus, such as a conservation economy. There's an interesting alignment also between carbon storage and First Nations-led conservation, which is a co-benefit of land-based carbon projects. A carbon project may align better with territorial stewardship and protection than extractive industries such as logging. And lastly, a well-designed land-based carbon project can be linked to cultural maintenance and revitalization. Next slide, please. The BC Assembly of First Nations and Ecoatress Canada will be creating some essential capacity building digital tools and content for First Nations in BC in order to deal with two fundamental questions about forest carbon offsets. And Patricia and Denby. We'll be speaking about this later, but a couple of the questions our future work will answer is a forest carbon project feasible in our territory, and how do we develop a forest carbon project on our territory? So that's kind of an exciting new project that we're working on together. And that brings me to the end of my section. Sanchelia.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That's excellent and very much appreciated. Next up, we have David Oxley from the Coastal First Nations and the Great Bear Forest Carbon Project. Thank you.
Thanks, Patricia. That was a really good presentation. Danny and I were thinking, how much detail can we go into? And you answered a whole bunch of questions. We were thinking, I'd like to do that, but we're not going to have time. Anyway, so thanks for that, Michelle. So I think Danny's putting up our, oh yeah, here she comes. So yes, the Great Bear Rainforest Carbon Projects, of which there are 3. The first were started by Coastal First Nations through the Great Bear Initiative Society, which when the projects were close to being up and running, GBI, Great Bear Initiative, created a corporate side. And so we have the Great Bear Business Corp, the Great Bear Carbon Credit Corporation, and the Great Bear Carbon Credit Limited Partnership. And next slide, please, Danny. One of our carbon projects is Haida Gwaii, which is all of Haida Gwaii, with the 2 communities and CHN as the signer. Our mainland carbon project is the northern half of the Great Bear Rainforest. And you can see some of our communities there around Kitimat, well, not so much Kitimat, Prince Rupert, and 2 lower ones. The Nunwakolas group, which is an alliance of 5 nations, they manage the south central coast, so the southern half of the Great Bear Rainforest. And we work cooperatively with them on a number of sales projects and just maintaining our projects. And the project area is outlined by the gray line, the 3 projects area. Next slide, please, Danny. So this is the largest Indigenous-led forest carbon project in Canada. Now, 85% of the forests are protected. It's the 3 projects, Haida Gwaii, North Central Mid-Coast, South Central Coast. These 3 projects were validated. They were created under BC's Forest Carbon Offset Protocol. They deliver about 1.1 million tons annually since 2012. And an example of a client is the BC government. And the BC government acclaims carbon neutral status with our offsets and other carbon projects in the province. About half are ours, though. So. Next slide, please, Danny. And conservation is a big part of carbon projects, and these 3 graphics will show you. So you see 2005, there's very little protected area, and this actually just shows the Great Bear Rainforest, doesn't also include Haida Gwaii, but it gives you the sense of what happens in a carbon project. Our first carbon project came online in 2009. They're not fully static. They will evolve. There can be further changes. So you can see the protected areas in 2009, and then we get up to 2016, and there was a reorganization of both of the Great Bear Rainforest management units, which impacted our projects. It protected more areas, reduced the annual allowable cut, and provided more carbon offsets for us. Next slide, please, Danny. So we've got, as you can see, about 2 million plus hectares in new protected areas. And one of the main achievements of this is now the co-management of the terrestrial protected area and the forest between our First Nations. Coastal First Nations is an alliance of 9 nations now. And the co-management is on a government to government level, which, if you know the history of BC, that wasn't the case before. This is, we see as a huge achievement. Our nations now have a say in what happens in their backyard. And our nations, we know the Helsik, who, Bella area, have been here 15,000 years. They're going for another 15,000. They need the Great Bear Rainforest to do that. A lot of this is done before there were, probably 5 or 6 years of land use agreement negotiations leading to the end agreements that we'll get to in a moment. Next one, Danny. Oh, this is Danny.
Good afternoon, everybody. So one of our biggest, I guess, achievements through our carbon offset program is our Guardian and Watchman program through our communities. It's allowed us to achieve quite a lot. Listing some of our pieces through governance and stewardship, healthy ecosystems, well-being of our member nations. Those are the 9 nations we spoke about that fall within the CFN. And it's allowed our nations to have authority and responsibility where previously, without Guardian Watchman program, they did not have, over their own waters, their own space, effective monitoring, enforcement, adaptive management. It again just contributes to the governance and stewardship of our nations. And then going to people, communities, ecosystems, lots of social economic benefits, restoring community resilience, including food security and salmon and food for cultural purposes through the stewardship program, and allows us to shift to a diverse, equitable conservation economy. That is the continuing goal over time for all of our nations. So 65% of our revenue that comes in from our carbon sales, 65% of it goes towards stewardship. So it would go towards this Guardian Watchman program, for example, among the other pieces on this page. And then the other 35% remaining goes to the choice of the nations, how they'd like to distribute that. And that could be for education, that could be for tons of programs within their communities individually. So yes, we have 7 stewardship offices that have been established and are maintained by carbon revenue. We have technicians that are funded, positions that are funded by this program for fisheries, Guardian and Watchman, Community Watchman, and community programs, bear safety being one of those. Touching back to what David had mentioned, managing on a government-to-government basis for conservation. Same applies to biodiversity. So we work directly with the government to make those decisions and to do that together. Sitting across the table on level with each other, government to government basis. It's a huge piece of how we're able to do what we can do. Again, creating new jobs in forestry. Total recorded right now, we have 140 positions that are funded or supported by revenue from carbon offset sales. Looking at new clean energy opportunities, as well as ecotourism. Yes, so obviously our goal ultimately in carbon offset sales is to build a sustainable coastal economy. You know, what we do is allows us to strengthen the connection between our communities. So communities do work together to do what we do. And obviously it's going to benefit our environment, overall economy. So opportunities that would come up would be a new carbon offset opportunities. And what that would mean is, so can we change our methodologies? We're looking at our methodologies and can we get more tonnage out of our existing projects? Can we bring in more revenue and more sales to our nations? Sustainable forestry, clean energy, ecotourism, revitalized fisheries, and shellfish and seaweed aquaculture. So I'll hand it back to David to touch on our agreements between nations and the provincial government.
Yeah, what became the, I already mentioned all the land use agreements that had to be signed. There were about 8 different agreements that some don't even seem related to, but eventually led to reconciliation protocol agreements, which is kind of the core creation of carbon offsets. So where any nation in BC currently needs to sign a reconciliation protocol agreement, we signed version 1, 2011, and we're working on version 2 right now, have been for last 3 years. The next step after you have a reconciliation protocol agreement, the Crown, the BC government, does claim ownership of all carbon offsets on Crown land. And right now there are sharing agreements. Originally it was the ABSA, the Atmospheric Benefit Sharing Agreement. Now it's evolved to the Indigenous Atmospheric Benefits Agreement, new name. But it defines the sharing of the offsets in a project area. This doesn't address rights and title, but it sets up a mechanism where we can we can sell offsets before that step is taken. The sharing is our nations get 80% of the offsets from their territories. The provincial government gets 20%. And next slide, Danny.
So we'll move into questions next that we have to touch on here. So we've got what challenges and or policy legal barriers do you face, and what recommendations would you make to other First Nations pursuing projects or to the provincial government? So a few things is that we're not cap and trade here in British Columbia. There are other provinces where the market is cap and trade. We are not that here in British Columbia. So we don't have, I guess, sort of a framework sometimes on the market and pricing. Our project was verified by the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, as mentioned before, is through the BC government. And so that can leave us, make us not competitive to other types of buyers. So for example, technology companies are not necessarily looking for a project that has been validated by a government provincial body, and they might want a voluntary verifier. So different types of,
Danny, if I could just step in. We've experienced over the last 5 years that the FCOP, the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, is just not well known internationally. We now have sales in the UK, we have sales in the States, and we have sales partners both here and in the States, and we're being told FCOP is becoming more well known, and it is a bit of a block, but it's becoming less so. The protocol itself, nobody questions, it's just they don't know it. Sorry, Danny.
Thank you, David. That is great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Market variability and lower cost of offsets on international markets. So, right now online, any of us could go out into the world and look for buy carbon offsets right now online with our simple debit card even. Could be $2 or $3 per ton. That's not what our tons will cost, and because the cost of our tons is also created by where the purpose of our revenues is going, right? So when somebody buys our tons, they're investing in towards our nations and towards our projects, stewardship into our communities. That's how we value our tons. But a project that has been approved or verified for 25, 30 years can also sell carbon tons for $2–3 per ton, right? So that variability, and again, we're not cap and trade here in British Columbia. And then generally speaking, the carbon sector is still very new and evolving with multiple changes. We see that a lot. There's constant changes coming up in the industry through the market, different projects and different values, always things up and coming. Actually, just popping back into there's something that Michelle had mentioned, and that's permanence. Is that a project that might not necessarily be planned to be a carbon project for the next 100 years? They could still sell tons just the same we would. Same any other carbon project, no matter who owns it, can still sell the tons of the same value you do, but the money is going into a pocket versus, again, going back to our nations. Next question, what economic benefits has the carbon offset project brought? So we did touch on this a little bit earlier, but again, we've established and maintain 7 stewardship offices in our communities, through our communities. Since the start of our program, sales have elapsed $60 million, and we support 140 jobs across the nations. What do carbon rights mean for CFN? Through our sharing agreements, our nation partners and BC government recognize the carbon offsets and the rights to sell them. And so I think David did touch on this quite well already. If we have any more questions, we're happy to touch on that. How does the project reflect CFN goals for your communities? Has it contributed to the community's well-being? What we seek to address through our projects is the marketing of our offsets has to be end-use clients who demonstrate support for CFN's goals. And so what that means is that we won't necessarily sell to everybody, right? There are certain nations or member nations and just history over time of gas and oil that we will not sell to. So our people that we work with do need to be able to represent and demonstrate what we want, what we want for the best of our nations. Moving forward, marine and land resources in the Great Bear region. Increased local control and management of forestry and fisheries. Sustainable development through ecosystem-based management. And again, that's a big piece because that's something we're always just continuing through the future and planning for decades in the future. Capacity building in all of our communities. And lastly, partnerships with the government, industry, environmental groups, and others. Partnerships are a big part of our program, and any nation that is considering approaching this, know that partnerships do need to be strong and that they're going to be a big piece of what you're able to do. And lastly, has the project enabled other opportunities to advance your interests? So for us at CFN, yes, we've been able to expand beyond our original plans with what carbon revenue was to bring, and that's our MAP program, and that's ocean protection and planning, and our blue carbon research project, which we don't need to dive into too much, but in essence, we are looking at, we're doing research for kelp farms. So that's a big project that we've been running, and we are in our second year of that program. Second or third, David, please correct me.
Kind of moving to the third.
Yeah, there you go, exactly. But so we have been able to continue on other opportunities, and we're always looking within our nations of what we need and what more we can bring to the table. And just end off on Indigenous-led governance and stewardship supported by durable, self-determined finance secures the well-being of people and ecosystems across the Great Bear Rainforest and sea. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danny and David. That's wonderful to learn about, and such a compelling, beautiful project, and really a guiding light for a lot of stuff that has happened since and that will continue to be happening. And excited for the continued success and evolution of that project, in its own microcosm, as well as, as you mentioned, the carbon market changes, the demand changes, and more people become aware of the project, its values, and that even though it's to the BC standard, which is actually a very high standard, that it can play into these voluntary roles as well as the more BC focused one. So next we have William David of the Assembly of First Nations. Thank you very much for joining us, William, and looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. So Saigon Samagogo, William David. I'm coming at you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. I'd just like to start by thanking Knowledge Keeper McIntosh for the warm welcome. As I stand in awe by my fellow speakers. So I certainly have, I would say, probably the least amount of experience in actually doing anything with carbon offsets of us here. In fact, most of my interaction with this subject matter has been more around the establishment of the right, which has been going on for quite some time, going back, for me at least, the Sapir and Gray cases out of New Brunswick, and just trying to establish carbon as a incident of title. And then the other area where, excuse me, I've had challenges over the years is looking at things like the REDD+ system, which is the international reforestation initiative, and generally the lack of what we would call safeguards in there for Indigenous people's rights, specifically the incoherence between no safeguard or an inadequate safeguard, and then the declaration, the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples on the other hand. I just want to start by saying that the ownership issue is not, in my mind, closed or settled, although I do think that for the purposes of trying to proceed with this initiative, it's not necessarily a barrier, or as much of a barrier as it would have been, say, 10 or 15 years ago. And that's really largely due to the solid work of my co-presenters, as well as others that have really blazed trails in terms of moving into this area. I do want to say that actually developing these kinds of projects can really support Indigenous rights in a few ways. And I guess it's basically what I'm left to say here is just to point out that through active management of the territory, if that's something that First Nations are looking at, that in itself helps to mobilize traditional occupations, traditional uses of the resource, which itself basically helps to keep practices of rights current, and it provides some degree of economic incentive for that activity to continue, which is, again, something that's fairly important. The other thing that it does is agreements and partnerships that are made with government or non-government actors provide enough of a linchpin for First Nations to start asserting jurisdiction over how the lands themselves are actually going to be managed in this context. And while it's not necessarily the same as a formal agreement recognized by government, which would recognize title, those assertions of jurisdiction themselves over time can grow and become much more assertive assertions, I should say more effective assertions of First Nations rights, title, and jurisdiction. The other key piece that someone like me has seen throughout my career, at least, is that also by protecting the lands in this way, there's more of a likelihood to displace economic activities which are directly incompatible with exercises of First Nations rights, particularly use rights or exercises of First Nations jurisdiction. So I guess I would just, I would leave it at that for now. The other points that I wanted to make about this and about sort of like where rights can fit, or ideas about using the jurisdiction, is just to keep in mind that there are, as others have mentioned, there are a lot of different systems out there for certification and credentialing. So I'm more familiar with the US system, but I do know like the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine is licensed, for instance, or has a project that's accredited in California under their cap and trade system. On top of that, many of the nations like the Passamaquoddy Nation are using, as we've heard already, a carbon market or an offset system as part of a larger economic development strategy to implement a green economy. And that's something that's really critical to think about, because while double counting will not be tolerated in terms of carbon emissions, there are other kinds of offsetting regimes and other kinds of offsets that one might be able to develop, which could be constructive here. And in my mind, what I'm thinking about are examples like an Ontario First Nation, which basically decades ago used essentially a species at risk habitat swap as an economic lever to develop a bit of a community forest. Those kinds of possibilities should actually be examined closely in the context of what First Nations are trying to do here in order to maximize the amount of, I guess, market economic benefits that come out of this, but also to really think about as well, mobilizing traditional economies as well through an initiative like this. So that's those points. And then the last point that I wanted to leave everybody here with, beyond the importance of doing research for First Nations that are thinking of entering this area, different kinds of regimes that are out there, is also to really think about, for those First Nations that are contemplating moving into this area, development of your own capacity in terms of support services for other First Nations that are out there. So that can be thinking about support capacity on the credentialing side or on the monitoring side. In other words, you can think about this opportunity in terms of the global market beyond just actually running it on a project by project basis, but also think about the services as well. And in the interest of time, that's about what I have. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, William. Really appreciate that overview, and it is great to get that sort of more North American and broader overlook, and really neat to hear the part that you spoke about in there, that in doing the practices that are fit for crediting through carbon offset development, Indigenous communities are often very directly strengthening, and I won't use the proper terms, but really the claim and the use and continuous use of the landscape. And that's a really neat point of the synergies of using projects like this to continue to ratchet up sovereignty control over the landscape. So that's very exciting. I will now pass the mic over to Warren Greaves. Really looking forward to your discussion. And Warren is with the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. Thank you.
And thanks to all the presenters, and also a special thanks to Michelle Connolly. Over the weekend, in preparation for this, I reread and then reread the BCAFN discussion paper, and I think it's a really good. It just encapsulates a lot of the issues, and I think a lot of what I'll cover today was also touched on by some of the previous presenters. So. Thanks in advance for doing that. But before I get too much into it, my name is Warren, and I'm with the BC government. I am very lucky to be on traditional Algonquin territory, which is the home of the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich First Nations. And by way of territorial acknowledgement, I want to share something I jogged by the other day, which is in Cedar Hill Park. Designed by artist Carrie Newman, and you can hit these with your hand, and they make a really good, really interesting sound depending on where you hit them. They're called earth drums, and based off of what I read on the District of Saanich website here, Carrie Newman, this was his attempt at trying to get people to engage with reconciliation through sound and its impact on the land. I thought it would be interesting to share for this. The topic of reconciliation is what makes me really happy and lucky. I feel really lucky to do the work that I'm doing, because hopefully with carbon offset standards and methodologies, this will enable Indigenous reconciliation in BC. So that's my link in there. So today I'll be talking about the BC offset program and different requirements under that program. I'll then do a brief once over of the forest carbon offset protocol, which is undergoing development and will be imminently released. Yeah, I'll talk about timing and next steps. I will also, I think I'm more interested and I'm going to try and keep my presentation pretty brief because I really want to hear from you. And I recognize some folks that I've chatted with before on the call, but I'm interested in hearing from you, like questions as well as feedback as well. And that's the really valuable part of today for me. I'm trying out a new slide here. You'll have to give me feedback and let me know how I did. There's a whole host of interests at play in the development of carbon offsets. And so I thought that it might be kind of cool to break down who is who in the zoo. So typically a polluter typically wants an offset. And these could be regulated emitters. So this is a polluter that has some sort of regulatory obligation under a cap and trade system or some other sort of compliance system. Or it could be a lot of what we're seeing these days, which are polluters that have made some sort of pledge like net zero or what we're calling ESG, environmental, social, and governance pledge. And they are purchasing offsets from offset project developers. The tree, I think, is meant to represent forest carbon, but there's other different types of carbon offset projects as well. The other person here, the other entity here is carbon offset project developers, and these typically have been, business to business, private agreements between parties. So that's kind of at the surface. That's kind of what's going on. There's also, and this is where we come in, carbon offset protocols and methodologies. And BC's Forest Carbon Offset Protocol is one of many methodologies. You'll see others out there. And some standards are for the compliance market, like we talked about with regard to polluters. And other standards are more intended for the voluntary market. And I think lately we're seeing a blending of the two. And actually credits generated from BC are actually usable in both compliance market and voluntary market. I'll talk about that in a sec. If you scratch a bit further, you see verification and validation bodies. As Michelle talked about earlier, these are the third-party auditors that go and make sure that the requirements of protocols and standards have been followed. You then, because these are market mechanisms, you have investors and other funders. And because they're market mechanisms, you also have people speculating on that, and we're seeing a little bit of an increase in that. And sort of new to the universe, but there's a bunch of interested bodies that are paying a lot of attention to the rigor, both of a carbon credit and what is a credible carbon credit, but then also what is a net zero pledge. So the supply side and the demand side of carbon offsets. There's two groups doing some really great work right now that I'll mention, and they both have the word integrity in them, so it's a bit confusing, but there's the Integrity Council on the Voluntary Carbon Market, and this is the successor of the Mark Carney task force that was established. And there's also the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and that's looking more at net zero pledges, among other things. And yeah, these are market advisory and oversight, and they're sort of international bodies that are trying to refine this nebulous space a little bit more. Not mentioned here is an industry association, AIDA, the International Emissions Trading Association, who does some really great work trying to drill deeper on the carbon market. And of course, enabling all of these different entities at once are really talented consultants. So a bit more on BC's carbon market. Like was mentioned earlier, since 2010, we've in part through offsets, reached carbon neutrality as a public sector, and we do that through the Carbon Neutral Government Program. And as I'll show in the next slide, a significant amount of tons generated in BC go towards carbon neutral government. There's also voluntary retirements. Talk a little bit more about that. The two sort of circles at the bottom really speak to emerging opportunities probably for BC's offsets. And that includes forthcoming linkages to the output-based pricing system, which is the federal carbon pricing mechanism. And then we're also seeing different international offset marketing opportunities, such as the carbon offsetting and reduction scheme for international aviation. Like I mentioned, the majority of demand, so these are what we call retirements. So that's when a credit is consumed and claimed as an environmental reduction by the polluter. So the number of retirements from carbon neutral government have sort of remained a little bit static, but we have seen an eightfold increase in the voluntary carbon market demand retirements in 2021. So I think we're seeing a lot of hype and buzz around net zero obligations that are coming to light here. But I don't want to oversell the market opportunity here. I think carbon credits are just one tool to get to an outcome. I don't want to oversell carbon credits as a thing that's going to blow up, even though, you know, I think there definitely will be an increase. I think it's really good to have managed expectations, and so for the next few minutes here, I'll get into some of the rules and requirements and that sort of thing. So it's very detailed, but it's really just an overview, high-level depiction of the regulatory process for getting a carbon credit issued. The different swim lanes here show the different entities at play. You have the project proponent. The VVB is the third-party verification and validation body. GHG regulator, that's us, the provincial government in this case. And then where projects are on Crown land, I think very applicable given this, the focus of today's talk is about land-based offsets. For projects on Crown land, the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and the Ministry of Forests is also involved. What a project proponent will do is look at the rules that have been developed by the standard body and do some sort of feasibility assessment. And I'll get into that a little bit later. There's also going to be, and we talked about property rights a little bit with William there. Right now, property rights for the offsets have been dealt through atmospheric benefit agreements or atmospheric benefit sharing agreements, now called Indigenous atmospheric benefit agreements. While those are being negotiated, there's also consideration around ownership, property, contractual rights, and land access. And this could have to do with tenure. While those are getting assessed, the proponent is developing a project plan. That project plan is then validated by the verification and validation body. And then we, as the regulator, approve, we receive those documents, a big package of materials, and then we approve the project. Then at that point, once a project is approved, the proponent can start shopping around for buyers of those offsets because there's actually an approved project on a registry. And here are some, just a little disclaimer for those interested at looking at requirements for selling to the government of BC, which was put in by my colleagues in the carbon neutral government team. Once a project is up and running, they can develop a project report. That project report is then verified from credits from the sequestration that occurs in that particular project report period. We then issue credits based off of that. Based on the outcome of the atmospheric benefit agreements, some credits may go back to the province or be distributed to other parties to the atmospheric benefit agreement. So us, the regulator on the BC registry, then issue the credits to the proponent, who can then transfer them or sell them. The process, like I mentioned, of canceling the unit for the purposes of that environmental benefit is called retirement. At the time when the holder of the offset wishes to retirement, they would send another request to government, and we would retire the units. After a project, proponents must provide a monitoring report, which is done in the same manner as the project report. It also needs to be third-party verified, and that continues for 100 years in the case of sequestration projects. And this is just to indicate that typically these happen annually, but they could be in periods of up to 5 years. Because this was kind of spoken to a little bit, I might just whip through this, but the majority of my job is making sure that we are looking at the things that Michelle talked about earlier. We're assessing the safeguards to make sure that carbon offset projects are real and conservative, additional, permanent, and verifiable. The activities that we're enabling include tree planting, afforestation and reforestation, conservation and improved forest management through reduced harvest, as well as avoided conversion from forest land to non-forest land. So in the protocol, you see requirements that talk about project eligibility. And then we also, in the protocol, include the requirements that make sure that the carbon credit that's generated is of high quality. You'll sometimes hear the words environmental integrity as well. And yeah, the BC Assembly First Nations discussion paper has a really good example of some of these criteria that we're looking at. Some considerations, and this may be covered off a little bit later, but here's some high-level things for those that are considering carbon offset projects. Like I mentioned, it may not be the solution for everything. Typically, projects need to be large enough in scale to overcome those monitoring, reporting, and verification costs. Like I mentioned, there's third-party auditing that basically goes along with a lot of different steps in the approval process, and that comes at the cost of the proponent. The project needs to be additional, so it needs to be in addition to some sort of status quo. So a good test rule of thumb in terms of additionality is it a new management practice or an intervention in historic activities? Is the activity eligible under the protocol? I sort of went over the high-level requirements, but that's another thing to assess. And then, of course, the big ticket item here is property rights. Do you have the property rights for the credits, or is work underway to get those property rights? If the answer to any of those is no, it might be worth revisiting the project. Well, I see we're getting lots of questions. Okay, cool. And I'm happy to return back to some of those criteria as well too. Just before I do that, the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol, it's currently with our lawyers. Release is imminent. Unfortunately, I can't share a specific time, but know that our goal is to have it out in public so project developers can start to use it as soon as possible. We also plan on having a few more pieces of guidance. So we do plan on having guidance for existing projects that would be looking to extend their crediting periods. We talked about the Great Barrier Reef Forest projects earlier. So we'll be releasing that as well. There will also be guidance and requirements for developing projects on Crown land. And we realize that this is a big barrier, and it's an area of uncertainty for especially First Nations looking to develop these projects. And we're hoping to release that later this year. The BC Assembly First Nations discussion paper is awesome. I'm including this in the link in the suggested reading here if you want to get some more details. I will also refer people to, and I find I send this link a lot, Treasury Board Directive 215, and that's the authority to dispose of atmospheric benefit rights. And that's the rules and guidance as to how you establish atmospheric benefit agreements. There's other helpful links here as well. We'll mention it because I worked really hard on it. the What We Heard document for the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol engagement that occurred in 2021 is also public on our website, and that's the link to it there. And I would be happy to take more conversations offline if folks have other questions, especially if they're considering jumping in and starting to get serious about a project. So I'll wrap it up there.
Thank you so much, Warren. Deeply informational and educational on the work that you and the team are doing, and the hustle that you guys have to get this, next iteration of FCOP 2.0 over the line, and really keep and continue the development of a really high quality offset standard. The additional challenges of writing that into law and having it be part of acts, and then creating a structure that we can also get real projects on the ground, a protocol that's usable to do all this good work and the good promise of that work, and keep it all balled up into one. So really appreciate all of that. So we are now going to move into question and answer. We've got about a half hour, 25 minutes, half hour to do that, which is really great. So I'll encourage people to either raise their hand, and we can call on folks as we see them. And also please feel encouraged to write questions into the chat, and we'll have a team, we'll work on reading those out into the question flow. So does anybody have any questions for any of the presenters? Brian E., I see a question from Brian E. Penn, who is a co-founder of the Cheakamus Community Forest Offset Project all the way back in the day and instrumental in making that move forward. And she's asked, where is carbon landing now that the Ministry of Forests has split up?
I can take a quick stab at that. I don't think it's impacting government's ability to engage with First Nations on the negotiation of atmospheric benefit agreements. Most of the people that were involved with the development of atmospheric benefit agreements do still rest with the Ministry of Forests. Where there is a reconciliation process underway, that's when the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation gets involved.
Excellent, thank you. Love to turn the mic over to Joel Marriott, who's raised his hand.
Hi there, thank you. I have a quick question about carbon credits. Is there other options in the type of credit and the carbon storage that it's going to be using for?
Can you tell us, I was just going to ask you to unpack that a little bit more.
Oh, me? Okay, so I was looking at the carbon credits that I'm looking at right now are in the industrial hemp side. The reason why I'm asking about forestry and the other stuff is that if it's locked to that, is there other options down the road for other businesses that are in the process right now of creating housing, creating clean energy, and then utilizing those growth for the hemp to become something more in that carbon credit? Because I have the license, we're working on this right now, but we've been reaching out nonstop to multiple nations because I'm not part of any nation. I'm a 60 scoop kid. So we fall under urban, but when we reach out to other people and other organizations and stuff, even the government, we come back to, go back to your nation. But under that kind of setup, it's kind of a little bit difficult for somebody like ourselves to reach to that level. So that's is there other ways for us to utilize our business and what we're planning on to use that as a carbon storage and carbon credit for this kind of idea?
Thank you. That's very clear, Joel. Does anybody have any takes or would like to answer that?
Yeah, David here, Great Bear Carbon Credit. We're right now doing a blue carbon quantification methodology research project because we, and it will, for BC and any like areas. And we've ended up choosing kelp because BC's geography, we don't have the tidal flats, and we certainly don't have mangrove forests, and there are other seagrasses, but our project so far has indicated that for our area, kelp would probably be the best blue carbon source. And so a kelp farm would be established, and kelp is always settling to the ocean floor, and that's where the storage of the carbon ends up. So I don't know if that actually answers the question. There are other blue carbon protocols in the world. Ours is probably a couple of years away from being available to develop blue carbon projects from.
I'll hop in with a quick point there, Joel. And so part of this question is, what type of offset methodology, AK protocols, are available there to credit the climate benefit that you are creating with your project? And then even David makes a good point that there will be sort of regional affinities for spending the time and doing the work to develop new protocols that will fit well with the ecology of a place. And so I think where you're looking at hemp and the different building benefits, food benefits, et cetera, working to segment sort of under what facets you're creating a carbon benefit. And then there are sort of voluntary carbon standards and the verified carbon standard, gold standard, American Carbon Registry. So Warren has been talking about, and a lot of us are working under sort of the BC construct. And it has specific protocols that are built over time and hard won. And so it may be that they don't add a protocol in the near or in the future for a type of project like yours, but you could look around at these other voluntary carbon markets, which may be more open to having different protocols or may have them already, and give you a tool to quantify that carbon benefit and then connect it out to buyers in the voluntary carbon market space. So that's sort of what I would suggest around that. Anybody else have any questions? I'll read out Douglas's question. Our nation is currently in reconciliation talks with the BC government. What would you suggest to help our position and nation to get involved in carbon credits in the near future?
I will maybe refer to Michelle here. I unfortunately can't speak to any atmospheric benefit agreements or reconciliation process discussions in progress. I would say though, some of the things that I have seen in reconciliation agreements is explicit mention of the word carbon and carbon projects. And maybe someone else can expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, David, again. In terms of a reconciliation protocol, that's great that that's going on. It also depends on the size of your territory. For our nations, some of our nations have territories large enough that would support a project on their own, but some of our nations' territories are quite small, and it would not be economically viable for them to get a carbon project going. And part of approval of a carbon project is its economic viability. So by bringing these nations together, that became a non-issue. So yeah, territory size is definitely a concern, but we found recently that our nation's territories are all contiguous, they're all neighbors. But we found that you can develop a project and you could have somebody down in, or a nation down the Kootenays, a nation up in the Northeast, the far Northeast, and one in the Chilcotins. And these non-contiguous territories could be formed into a carbon project. So even if you're very small, there are options. We're looking into this more to see what the options are.
Excellent, thank you. And I think a really key component that David mentioned there is this ability to group projects that are sufficiently similar so that they have the same carbon offset fundamentals. One of the terms for that is a program of activities. You know, I think that the three Great Bear Rainforest projects have done a really excellent job in demonstrating where you can pull together enough gravity that you can protect a lot of landscape, create a lot of really heavy environmental and social benefits, and get it over the line. So I think that ability to coalesce and to come together and around projects that are sufficiently similar and hence can be sort of credited through the same process is really important. There's a great question here from Darcy Riddell, and actually even sort of pointing it potentially at William here, and it's this idea of nations designating a chief mining officer within this other jurisdiction, and how that could be rolled into declaring intention and building momentum around declaring carbon rights. Curious for any take you have.
Thanks. Yeah, so a couple of things. My own take on that is I think that's a fantastic idea. As is often the case with First Nations, I think a number of different approaches are always, like, it's always good to have a number of different tools and different approaches to entering, say, like a market. I think what we have here in this collection of speakers are speakers who are extremely adept and have been quite successful in navigating the current system that's out there. I myself and others have made reference to for instance, like voluntary markets. And there's nothing that prevents, for instance, First Nations in BC or Indigenous peoples more broadly from developing a voluntary market. The challenge, of course, is that takes a considerable amount of capacity and time. And then the other thing that I was remiss and didn't mention earlier is just to point out as well that marketing can be a really, really big issue here. And I say that just because there's tremendous goodwill in the international community to be sponsoring projects for Indigenous peoples, particularly projects which mobilize Indigenous rights or jurisdiction, traditional occupations and traditional economies. But the thing is that if we allow our views of what carbon means to be subsumed underneath a system that's basically a more bland regulatory approach, it's harder to actually do that marketing. And again, that's all the more credit to the other presenters that they've managed to actually succeed while doing that. But I do think that's something that's really critical. AFN recently received a mandate from the Chiefs Assembly to potentially support this kind of thinking as well that Darcy's referencing, just in terms of supporting First Nations rights in the context of credits, but also thinking about issues like how to build infrastructure. The big caution that I put around that, though, is that it takes quite a bit of effort and time to be able to put something like that together. But I do think it's really critical, only because it allows First Nations then to explore on our own terms what a green economy could look like, rather than having to take a carbon credit approach, then a biodiversity offset approach, then say like a fisheries approach, all separately. They're very, very connected and interrelated. And again, I just gotta say credit to the presenters for being able to do all of that. But it's a lot, and it's very, very hard, I think, to actually segment these things and break them apart in the regulatory context. So it'd be much better if we actually had a system that we controlled that actually allows us to think about not only carbon, but also just really the economy and the green economy more sustainably. Thank you.
That's excellent. And that whole component is a really huge question of what is different now and what can and should be different in the future between Indigenous approach to carbon markets and the traditional existing approach. And I think that that is probably much too big of a topic for us to cover in its completeness today, but I think something that would be neat to noodle on or potentially build a session around later. And I think it really I think the way forward is the deeper understanding that parties can have of both how it currently works and a vision for how it could and should work and how this interfaces with Indigenous goals and priorities and vision, the better. Because the other version is that we don't talk across the aisle, as it were, there, and we have unforced errors. We run into problems that we wouldn't have needed to if we were all working together. And I think today's call is a great example of us seeking to work together. So I want to bring one last question to the fore, and I think that Great Bear team might be able to answer it well, or maybe BCAFN. And it's a question from Russ Priestley. I'd like to know how the BCAFN, whose goal is partially to protect Mother Earth, rationalizes projects and selling of carbon offsets that actually fund or protect fossil fuel projects that are untenable on a global scale, i.e. the LNG project that moves natural gas around the world, where there is already concerted efforts to remove natural gas as a clean fuel source due to the methane emissions. And I know, David and Danny, you spoke to this a little bit. It might be worth touching back on that for how your communities have addressed this. And I think a good indication how other communities can choose to address it as well.
Oh. Sorry, Joseph. I was trying to answer a chat message. Could you? What was your question?
So Russ is concerned that these projects are allowing fossil fuel to go ahead and for LNG to go ahead and stuff like that. And I know that you guys have a particular take and approach that you're taking, with this biggest project in BC around how you choose to deal with the opportunity to sell to those folks. And I thought you'd have a good take on that. And then we can also get Jamie after that.
Okay, yeah. Our mandate is, let me back up. 2019, we established a set of sales guidelines because we have turned down literally millions of dollars in sales to organizations that our organization feels that is not compatible with the environmental, social, and justice goals of CFN. We could have sold all our tons. We're sitting on an inventory. Well, we've just done a lot of verifications, but we're going to be sitting on an inventory of about 5 million tons. But we're planning that for the future. But they could all be gone if we'd sold to oil and gas. And carbon offsets are a temporary measure. I mean, reductions are better. If you're hauling if you're not putting carbon out there, that's better. But reductions, offsets are protecting the Great Bear Rainforest. The money is going into the stewardship activities, and it's the Indigenous nations who are leading this. And that is a big marketing point for our offsets. The integrity of our offsets, you can't question in how they're produced, how they're verified every year. But it's the funding to our nations that really attracts a lot of clients and has allowed us to sell above market value since 2012.
Thank you so much, David. And I think so to really put paid to that, Coastal First Nation is not selling to these organizations that were being raised as an issue, and they've made a specific decision not to. And they are foregoing, $50 million plus to make that decision. So it's an amazing case in point around this discussion. Different nations will have different opinions about this based on their own circumstances, and I think those are all very valid, but really great to have the Great Bear Rainforest example of this. Jamie, thanks so much for your insights.
Thanks, Josh. Or Joseph, sorry. So I guess to the question regarding BCAFN, BCAFN is an organization that's made up by the chiefs in assembly, so all 204 First Nations in BC. It's a nonprofit society. It doesn't have title, it doesn't have jurisdiction. We're an advocacy organization. So we don't run carbon projects. We don't own anything. We don't have title. We don't have rights. We're just an advocacy organization. So I just want to clarify that point. We also don't support projects per se, or we get our mandate from the chiefs. So to suggest we support LNG is incorrect. We don't support LNG. We only support things that we've been given a mandate from the chiefs on. So I just wanted to clarify that point. And when it comes to things and comments like carbon ownership, I mean, the big question here, like all other questions related to land ownership and the land is there's uncertainty in BC because of the unresolved jurisdiction between First Nation governments and the Crown, Big C Crown, that's provincial and federal crown. So, and that includes carbon. So yes, the Crown, provincial Crown claims ownership to carbon, whether it's land, air, or water, but that doesn't make it right. Nations have the opportunity and the jurisdiction to reclaim that ownership, and you do that through your laws and your policies therein, and you force the issue with the Crown. So we're here to provide that support, that advocacy support. The work we did on the toolkit and discussion papers is just that. So I just wanted to provide that clarifying point, Joseph. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for these questions and answers. And Patricia noted that BCAFN will circulate the questions and answers for anything that didn't get covered on the call today. I'd love to move to our last presentation, and that's a presentation by Patricia as well as Denby McDonnell of Ecoatress Canada to talk more about the BCAFN Ecoatress Canada project that we're working on right now.
Thank you, Joseph. And I think that was a very rich dialogue, and it looks like there are many opportunities and challenges that need further discussion and attention. Of course, carbon offset has both sides, that negative side, and that's also something that we need to bring to the table. That's the intention of BCFN with this carbon offset topic, is trying to put the topic on the table and bring the discussion to the nation, so you can discuss on what exactly is carbon offsets, and we just bring the tools. Of course, it could be an opportunity, it could not be an opportunity as well. Okay, about the project we have, I will share my screen now. Let me check. So recently, BCAFN and Ecoatress Canada have secured the foundations to begin a project called Enriching BC Capacity to Develop Forest Carbon Projects. Through this project, BCAFN and Ecoatress Canada want to support interested First Nations to prepare for and engage in carbon offset projects in a way that they achieve conservation economic goals and protect First Nations way of life while affirming inherent title rights and treaty rights. So the project has three goals: build and deliver capacity tools for First Nations in BC to protect forests through conservation and carbon offsets, support First Nations to scale up oil growth conservation, assert First Nations inherent rights, including culture and knowledge, and increase government and public awareness and support for conservation and carbon offset, including policy and regulation changes. The idea with the project is how we can link conservation and biodiversity goals with economic development and these and carbon offsets. I think that's a big discussion. So my colleague Denby from Ecoatress Canada will provide further details on some of the project's outcomes. And Denby, please, over to you.
Thanks, Patricia. Yeah, so my name is Denby McDonnell, and I'm the program manager of climate innovation, the other colleague of Joseph and Michelle's at Ecoatress Canada. And yeah, Patricia, maybe could you just jump ahead? I think I'll just sort of skip over the Ecoatress Canada slide because everyone's probably heard what they need to about us, but we're a not-for-profit charity, and our mission is to build an economy that provides for life. And so Joseph, Michelle, and I all work on the climate team, and we primarily work with Indigenous communities on forest carbon offset projects, as well as some of the other sort of policy kind of issues around carbon markets, and the Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund being one sort of main area of our work on making sure that that fund is administrating the funding to communities in a way that creates other benefits in the best way possible. Patricia, could you go to the last slide?
Can you see the last one?
I can just see your first slide still.
Oh, I think it's because I have a Zoom quit unexpectedly message here. Let me stop sharing my screen and I will share it again. I changed the slide, but it looks like
no worries if not. There wasn't a lot of content. I can just talk through it. But yeah, so our work with BCAFN is, and which is supported by the Metcalfe Foundation, is focused on building the First Nations Carbon Portal website, which because of our work at Ecoatress Canada, we found that there's a huge need to sort of enable communities to be advancing these kinds of projects, and there's not a lot of information out there about how to advance forest carbon offset projects in particular. So with that in mind, we've proposed to develop this Carbon Portal website, which will be the digital home of the Forest Carbon Community Toolkit, as well as what we're calling the PID web app. And the aim is for it to be kind of a one-stop shop to learn about forest carbon offsets and to evaluate the feasibility of potential carbon projects. And it will kind of allow First Nations to learn about forest carbon offset projects, core concepts, Indigenous rights and carbon, as well as evaluate the feasibility of potential carbon projects on their territories. And then within the website, we're going to build in some of our previous work on curriculum development, which we've called the Forest Carbon Community Toolkit, and that will be housed on the Carbon Portal. And we're developing the toolkit based on Ecoatress Canada's work, as well as BCAFN's previous work, creating communication materials on carbon offset project fundamentals and supporting First Nations project partners in deploying carbon projects. And so it will widely build knowledge about the core concepts in forest carbon offset projects and the steps to developing a forest carbon project. And video explainers will provide some baseline knowledge of concepts that are key to these projects. And we plan to keep engaging with communities through workshops to help pilot and scale up the toolkit. And then kind of the final main outcome of the project, at least in 2022, will be the project idea document web app, which will live on the Carbon Portal website. And this is also based on Ecoatress Canada's work with Indigenous partners to advance carbon offset projects. And the web app will allow communities to work actually directly through the feasibility assessment steps and the development of a project idea document, which are two key steps in early forest carbon project development. And so it will help guide First Nation project proponents through the process of describing project concepts, quantifying greenhouse gas emissions impacts, and documenting the forest carbon project to communicate to stakeholders. And so we see success here as First Nations in BC being able to advance a full feasibility assessment of forest carbon offset project opportunities on their territories and developing carbon finance projects that protect old growth forests where community aspirations and opportunities may align. And so if you're interested in some of this work and wanting to participate or have any questions about it, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Maybe we can share our contact info in the chat as well. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Denby. And that's bringing us to near the closing of our session. And I'd love to hand the mic back to Patricia to close this out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks, David. Denby, and thank you everyone for taking the time for joining us today. Thanks to our presenters and to Joseph for making this dialogue session happen. As we said, we will circulate the questions that haven't get answered to the presenters and then to circulate to the attendees. If you want to contact the presenters of the Bcfn or Ecoatress Canada team, the contact information is on the screen, and we will be posting the slides and the recording on the Bcfn website as well. Thanks again, and have a very, very good afternoon.